Hey everyone in business law. Quick review of Chapter 18, a transfer of title and risk of loss in sales contracts. We know as a general principle when a sale is executed, it's completed, meaning the buyer has the goods available for them to take possession of and completed the payment of it, risk of loss, title has passed then and there right in the moment. The ones that transfer later are for future goods, meaning that they either exist, don't use that word exist, they either are made, but the seller doesn't yet possess them or have control over them because they're at some other location or being sold as a third party first. Their risk of loss passes later. It makes common sense. Ownership is usually critical because we know in a contract to sell, ownership doesn't occur until the goods are made available to the buyer. If they're not made available to the buyer, there's a reservation of title still in the seller's possession, and therefore they bear the risk of loss, and creditors can seize them as if owned by the seller and not by the buyer. Therefore, creditors of the buyer wouldn't be able to seize them yet because they are considered future goods. Insurable interest, I like that for another class, but I tend to talk about it way too long. I won't bore you with it. But just because you don't yet have ownership of the goods, you might actually have an insurable interest, because if those goods are lost or destroyed, your business might suffer as a result. You're getting these goods to refurbish them or put them into other products, and without them you might lose profit and or have a huge setback in terms of your being able to be productive. So you might have an insurable interest because there's a reasonable economic expectation and viability in the continued existence and or manufacture of those goods. Just an interesting concept that you don't own it, but you might have the power to insure it because there's an economic expectation in it. A risk of loss, we know risk of loss is usually borne by the owner, and that's why it's important to determine who owns the goods at any given point. If it's a sale, at that moment, the buyer owns the goods. If it's a contract to sell, the seller still owns the good until that later juncture occurs. We can always put in the contract about risk of loss, changing these general terms. So what governs? The law governs in the absence of a contractual set of language about who bears the risk of loss at any point in any kind of contractual event. That's important because you have a lot of power if you're willing to take the courage and be able to negotiate terms that are much more beneficial to you in terms of risk of loss and who has to insure, or when you will in fact bear the burden. In a good, existing goods identified at the time of contracting, risk of loss is borne by the buyer right then and there. It's over. If it's a future good, marking and shipment gives the buyer a right to get insurance, but they don't bear the risk of loss until it's available to them, or depends on the two different kinds of contracts. One is called a shipment contract, and we went over this in a previous chapter. In a shipment contract, once the seller delivers it to a carrier, the seller's burden is completely gone unless they packaged it inappropriately. It is now the carrier's burden or the buyer's burden, and it all depends on the nature of what was written in the contract. So on a shipment contract, seller's obligation ends once it's given to the carrier. If the carrier does something negligently or inappropriately, or it just simply, if it's a public carrier and it falls into one of those exceptions, they're on the hook for any damage. Seller says, hey, don't look at me. I did everything I was supposed to, and it's a shipment contract. What you want as a buyer is a destination contract. That means the buyer and the carrier stay on the hook all the way until the time of the destination contract. Most contracts that I negotiate for, at least as a buyer, I want them to be destination contracts. I should bear no burden, no risk of loss, and I shouldn't have to go after the carrier. I should be able to go to the seller and say, get me a new sweater, get me a new widget, get me a new thing, whatever it was, because it wasn't delivered here in it, the whole form that it was supposed to be in. You should know about those. You should also know about, I don't care about too much about COD shipments. They don't happen too much anymore. You should know the term free on board. That's a destination contract. That means the seller not only has the obligation to get the goods to the buyer before any risk of loss passes, but it's also the seller's obligation to pay for it. It can be a big deal. Somebody buys like a sailboat that's really big and you can't transport it over land, and you bought it in Massachusetts. The negotiator was, but the boat's located in California. If you put free on board, that means the seller has to find a way and bear the liability of risk of loss to get that sailboat over here to Massachusetts if that's the point of destination. It could be hugely, it could be a lot more expensive than the boat itself. So be careful when you're in these situations. Fungible goods, I'm not worried about that. Now, what happens if there is damage or destruction of goods? If it's a total loss and it's a what? If it's a destination contract, seller bears the burden of loss. If it's a partial loss, the buyer can opt to say, well, I'll still take the goods subject to a reduction in its value, or they can treat it as basically a nullity and the contract is over, one or the other. And we know after the risk of loss passes and there's damage, it's the buyer has to eat it because the risk of loss is already passed. And the same with damage to unidentified goods. If the goods aren't identified, well, they're not the buyers. They're still the sellers in terms of risk of loss. They're going to bear the risk. The thing I really wanted to stress from this chapter, it's a dry chapter. Most students don't like it, but this is a big one. Sales on approval and in the sales with right to return. Most of us, when we buy goods, Walmart, Target, Kohl's, all these different kinds of sellers usually have a policy, 30 days, 60 days, 90 days. I don't know what they are. But that is a situation where you buy the goods, you bring them to the register, you give the money, you possess the goods. It's a sale. It's over. All the risk of loss is possessed by you. But oftentimes the seller of goods will give you something called a right of return, meaning that if you're, depending on what the terms of the right of return are, if you're just simply not happy with it, or maybe you bought it for a gift for somebody else, goes, I already got one of these, or this doesn't fit me, then the contractual arrangement was called a right of return. You actually had title, but you had a right to undo title and bring it back to the seller, provided you didn't damage it. Or nowadays they're making, because it's cost a lot of industry, a lot of money, they have these things called reshelving fees. I don't like them, but contractually they don't have to have a right of return. They can say all sales final. And when we get to the next chapter, which is about warranty, other than finding a defect in the goods, you wouldn't necessarily have a right to return them. So that's a right to return. Who bears it? So I say I buy a shirt. I haven't had a chance to wear it yet. I buy it, but I have a right to return it. And before I even use it or open it, my dog gets a hold of it and tears it up. Who's responsible for it? Well, I am, because title already passed to me. Let's say it's not even a dog. Let's say a terrible storm comes through, a tree comes through my house, all this water comes in, and the shirt's ruined. Do I have a right to return it now? No, because the goods have been damaged. Who bared the risk of loss? I did, because I already owned it. I had title. The ability to now undo that contract is gone. I bore the risk of loss because I had title. Title usually is the bearer of risk too. That's different though than sale on approval. And this comes up sometimes. And those of you that have to watch, we got rid of cable, so I don't watch cable like I used to. My kids got older, but we used to watch a lot of Nickelodeon and things like that. And other TV channels are obviously doing what? They're in a commercial break. They're trying to sell you something. Every so often you'll sell, use it for 30 days. If you're not completely satisfied, simply return it and pay postage and handling. That's a sale and approval. Title actually stayed with the seller during that period of time, unless you did something inconsistent with your potential to approve. So say you bought a good, say it's a mattress, and I get the mattress and I have 30 days to use it. And if I don't like it for any reason at all, I have the right to return it. That's a sale and approval, meaning I get to basically ferret out whether I like it or not. But if I do some act inconsistent with, say I get the mattress, I love it, and I decide to, I don't know, have my portrait in cloth embroidered into the mattress, I've obviously done an act inconsistent with my ability to return the goods, and therefore the sale and approval is no longer over. I've actually waived that and I've approved it in the term. But I remember when I was a kid, my parents used to get something called Funk and Wagnall encyclopedias. You get one and you have 30 days to look at it. If you didn't return it within 30 days, it was considered approved because the time had passed. But what happens within the 30 day? You had the right to use it. You had the right to thumb through it and see if you liked it. And if you didn't, you had a right to return it without risk. And what do I mean by without risk? Say while I possessed it, the dog ate it. Someone came in and stole it. I accidentally spilled coffee all over it. Who bears the risk of loss? Most of you can say, well, you're the one that possessed it. But I possessed it as a bailee, not as an owner, because it was sale and approval. Title still remained with the seller. And if they say no risk, they're also saying that you'll only be responsible for acts of basically fraud. You're intentionally destroying the book, or you're acting with gross negligence. Outside of that, the seller bears the risk of loss on sale and approval. It's a very dangerous contract to get into if you're the seller of goods. Usually it's for low-level price goods and goods that you have a lot of confidence in, that is very likely they're going to retain them and approve the sale. I wouldn't do it too much. What about that? Special rules on transfer. You need to know about sale by and trustee. And trustee is a type of merchant that deals in new and used goods of that kind. So if I take my watch, I just saw it a second. If I take my watch and I think this is a Seiko. Yeah, it's a Seiko. And I take this watch. It doesn't run by batteries, but say it did, and I take it into the jewelry store and they're real busy, and they say we can leave it off. I put a battery in here. You can come pick it up in 2 days. But they sell new and used Seikos in that store. What if the clerk, either intentionally or accidentally, put it in their used watches for sale rack? Some innocent purchaser comes in the next morning and says, "Oh, that Seiko looks pretty nice. It's $40. I'll buy it." And they buy it. Do I have a right to go after that person that bought it and say, "I want my watch back. That's mine. You had no real title to it. They didn't have power to pass title"? In that situation, believe it or not, it's no. Why? Because it's a sale by and trustee. They're a merchant that sells goods of that kind, and it's reasonable for a good faith purchaser to believe they have the ability to transfer title. My only remedy would be to sue the store for monetary losses. Now, the problem with this watch is, well, it's used. It's not worth that much. I think it cost me $200 when I bought it. I think it's a high-end watch. $200 a lot of money for a watch. But the thing is now it's used. It doesn't have that much value. And the reason why it's special to me, I remember I bought it the day my father died. I don't know why, just goofy. I figured I'd feel better, go buy something. So I bought an expensive watch. And so it has sentimental value to me. Can you sue for sentimental value? Absolutely not. You can only sue for monetary damages. So I'd be at a loss. Maybe the person that bought it would be nice enough to give it back to me and I'd pay them the money they paid the store for. But the question is, legally, do they have to return it? No. It's a sale by and trustee. And what is an trustee again? Someone that's a merchant that sells and trades in goods of that kind, because it's reasonable for the consumer to believe they have the ability to get title. Another one is a consignment sale. I talked about that in previous videos. If you're in the antique shop and I have some antiques, I don't want to open up my own antique store, but maybe I want to sell some of my antiques, and I say, hey, can I have like a little corner of your store? I want to bring some of my stuff, and you can sell it for me. I didn't give them title, but did I clearly allow them to pass title to a good faith purchaser? Absolutely. Another one's estoppel. This doesn't come up all that much, but usually it's nefarious. If I've done something to make somebody else look like they own things that are actually mine, and I don't know, maybe a friend of mine, say he has a motorcycle, that he actually tried to do this for a period of time. He has a nice motorcycle. He doesn't want his mother to know he's got a motorcycle, so he often kept it at my house, and he told everybody that I owned it. But I didn't. He did. But if he's telling the world and making me appear as though I own this ATV thing, could I sell it to a third party? And as long as that third party does it in good faith, they don't know Ron is the actual owner of the ATV, would title actually pass? Yeah, it's called estoppel. The victims are stopped from denying the existence of the legitimacy of the contract because of the circumstances they, made apparent to the world. Documents, if I was the title owner on paper, but it was really owned by somebody else, but we're trying to protect them from bankruptcy or something like that, clearly a fraudulent scheme in and of itself. But if I have a document that shows I'm the title owner or something, I have the power to transfer it. In fact, my son's car, I was just thinking it's my son's car. I don't know why, but I think when he bought it, it was his money, but I put it in my name, the title documents in my name. Could I go and sell his car? Yeah, I could. Although he'd have a right to sue me because equitably he owns the car, but on paper I do. And so that gives me the power to transfer. Those are called title documents. And then voidable title. Say there's a thief. They steal something from me. They steal this watch. Now, if they sell it to a third party in good faith for reasonable value, and that party didn't know it was stolen, the original thief doesn't have title, but does the purchaser get valid title? Believe it or not, they do. The original person that got it through fraud, trickery, or thievery, they don't have valid title, but a good faith purchaser would, and that surprises a lot of people. It's called voidable title. Usually it only relates to fraud, not so much theft. Theft, we often still mandate that the thief have to, even the third party won't have a good faith because they're buying from a thief. But if it's through fraud, usually title does pass. That's pretty much it. Try to keep it short this time.